Lobbying is big business, and fossil fuel lobbying is no exception. Over the last decade in the US alone, approximately $120 million have been spent on oil and gas lobbying each year.
This lobbyist admitted that, yes, we did sometimes deny, aggressively fight against climate science.
So, how do oil lobbies and trade associations help fossil fuel companies stay profitable? Some of the biggest names in the oil industry are Shell, British Petroleum, Exxon Mobil, Chevron, and Total Energies, and they're all part of lobby groups. Two major fossil fuel lobby groups are the American Petroleum Institute, or API, in the US and FuelsEurope in the EU. Companies like Shell, BP, and Exxon Mobil are part of both.
By looking at industry association, I think the API has over 600 members. You can look at basically a strategy of over 600 companies by just looking at one industry association.
That's Tom Holland. He works for think tank InfluenceMap. The company analyzes how business and finance impact the climate crisis.
And these industry associations are heavily engaged. We can see that through their profiles. So they're really getting involved in a variety of different strands of climate policy, sort of greenhouse gas reduction targets, or like EV transitions and renewable energy targets.
According to InfluenceMap, companies like Shell and Chevron pay up to $12 million a year to hold membership at the API. Membership at FuelsEurope is significantly cheaper, but still more than $2 million annually. So what's the bang for the buck here? Lobby groups have airtime in important places, in front of decision makers, for example, the EU Parliament, or a governor in the US. Then they come up with plans on how to convince politicians and influential people to back fossil fuels. This can impact legislation and water down laws that they believe are detrimental to the industry.
So they have relationships with politicians and they're drafting anti-protest laws, sending them and saying, hey, just drafted this. I think this could help with your efforts.
Amira Savas of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is talking about fossil fuel lobbyists in the US attempting to lobby against climate activists.
So what they're doing is trying to prevent protests so that you don't have public engagement either.
Here's another example of lobbying in the US. This concerns the debate over the introduction of a carbon tax, a proposed price on carbon that emitters would have to pay for their greenhouse gas emissions.
The carbon tax, which many of these companies and their associations claim to support, is a good talking point, in part because they don't expect that it will ever happen.
Kathy Mulvey is the accountability officer for the Union of Concerned Scientists.
That API can be a whipping boy for the companies, right? And so I think this is one of the things that a trade association or an industry group can really do the dirty work for the oil and gas companies. So they can say one thing and their lobby is doing another.
Oil lobbies use three distinct strategies. InfluenceMap identified these narratives. One is solution skepticism, which sort of downplays how vital new infrastructure and energy sources are. It casts doubt over it. For example, electric vehicles as a solution to cut transport emissions is met with skepticism from the oil and gas industry. They say that EVs won't have a substantial impact on the reduction of emissions and see doubt about their potential positive impact. The second is policy neutrality. This is when oil lobbies oppose policies that only promote clean technology. For example, advocating for low-carbon fuels to be included as renewable sources of energy.
They're not directly saying, that fossil fuel use needs to continue, but they are very much making sure that the mechanisms which are currently using fossil fuels remain in place.
And the third strategy is affordability and energy security, which I'll explain later. Lobbies are strong in the US, but they're vigorous here in Europe too. To put it in perspective, oil company Shell spends €4 million on lobbying in the EU annually. This company advocates for carbon capture and storage as a way of offsetting their current emissions. And through lobbying, fossil fuel companies have been able to deliver the solution to the EU, NGOs say.
one subject that is recurring often is the use of hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. And that's specifically for the lobby meetings that were held either with the fossil fuel companies or with that network. Now, this is sort of a solution that currently is quite debated by the science community, whether it's really effective or not. But we do see some results because we saw that in the new guidelines of the new European Commission, it is featuring quite prominently.
The EU and its institutions are often criticized for not being transparent enough in declaring lobbying activities. A report by Fossil Free Politics analyzing the European Commission's meetings showed that fossil fuel lobbyists met with EU Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen's team 900 times in the last 4.5 years. That's nearly one meeting every working day. And according to Transparency International, this reveals the abject power fossil fuel companies and their networks wield over EU climate policymaking. Yet lobbying doesn't exist in a vacuum. External events also shape the speed at which change happens. Following the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, there was a moment of euphoria over a quick transition to cleaner technologies and investment in new infrastructure. But then everything changed, says Bob McNally.
Inflation is back after decades and is a top public policy concern. Interest rates, which have been falling for decades, are up sharply.
McNally heads an energy consultancy firm with fossil fuel clients on his bill.
Parts of Europe and the Middle East are engulfed in major wars that have already impacted energy.
This has resulted in some companies pulling back on their climate promises and instead expanding their fossil fuel production. Clubbing together energy security and fossil fuels is the third strategy we talked about earlier. This narrative, affordability and energy security, centers on the idea that fossil fuels are cheaper and the alternatives are not there yet. Hence, we need fossil fuels.
For example, in the Caribbean, countries like Guyana have started investing more and more attracting more investment to oil and gas. Senegal is attracting new investments to oil and gas when they could be actually attracting investment could be going towards renewable energy.
Biomass, coal, and oil were the dominant energy sources for a very long time. In the 60s, nuclear energy was added to the mix. And in the 80s, solar and wind entered our energy system. That's according to our World in Data. Energy transitions are very slow and can sometimes take decades to come to fruition.
Usually, we add one new energy source to the existing energy sources. We rarely completely get rid of one form of energy. I think realistically, not only will we depend on oil and gas and even coal for many decades into the future, but we won't displace it as fast as I think people were hoping.
When the Biden administration set up the Inflation Reduction Act, a law that promotes clean energy, the API said the law amounted to wrong policies at the wrong time. It also said that zeroing in on EVs ignores fuel-based options that could better accomplish the objective to reduce emissions. But the International Energy Agency argues that we need a faster shift towards green tech and that EVs are key to decarbonizing road transport. Associations like the API and FuelsEurope have for a long time produced lobbying campaigns and crafted narratives favoring fossil fuels for both decision makers and the public. This is a dossier compiled by the Union of Concerned Scientists that also includes a 1998 internal API memo that sought to spread disinformation about climate science. Kathy Mulvey, who we heard from earlier, was one of the authors.
It was as the world was considering the Kyoto Protocol, which would have set binding emissions reduction targets. And so the American Petroleum Institute created something called the Global Climate Science Communications Team, or laid out a plan to create this team, which what they actually articulated was that victory would be achieved when average citizens understand uncertainties in climate science. The strategies included everything from recruiting scientists to carry that message of uncertainty.
Another more recent example in the US concerns methane emissions. Methane is a key component of natural gas. It's also one of the biggest contributors to climate change. In 2016, during the Obama administration, the first federal standards to regulate methane emissions from oil and gas operations were introduced. API clients at the time were big methane polluters, and the API claimed that this new regulation would have incurred high costs for them. So the API and other fossil fuel trade associations sued the US Environmental Agency. While they agreed that emissions needed to be reduced, they argued it would be best done without any regulatory oversight. Despite their attempts, the regulation was passed. But it was short-lived. In 2020, the Trump administration rolled back on the regulation, a move supported by the API. I reached out to both API and FuelsEurope for an interview. FuelsEurope declined. The API never responded. Lobbying itself, though, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a form of advocacy and can play an important role to amplify voices to ensure they reach policymakers. It's a legitimate part of political participation, where various groups, including nonprofits, unions, corporations, can all lend their voice. Coordinated efforts can lead to meaningful change. An issue arises, however, when there is an imbalance of influence.
The balance is a bit more in the favor of corporation by quite a large margin. And the reason why it's more in favor of corporation is because corporations simply have these very large business association and trade association, which most NGOs don't.
This relationship between fossil fuel players and decision makers was evident at last year's COP climate talks. For example, France brought along gas company Total Energies as part of its country delegation. The EU enlisted employees of BP, Eni, and ExxonMobil to be part of theirs. That's according to an NGO's analysis of COP participants.
It is hugely important for major oil and gas companies to be part of the energy policy conversation. So you saw them investing in technologies that would enable us to use oil and gas while reducing emissions, carbon capture, sequestration, green ammonia, and so forth, hydrogen, but also to invest in renewable energies. And they wanted to be part of that discussion. They don't want to suffer losses unnecessarily.
So, can there be a world without fossil fuels? Well, the industry and its lobbies claim to be on board with the energy transition and the phasing down of fossil fuels, while also advocating for climate solutions that include them. For instance, the API says that there should be more of a focus on developing carbon capture technology, insisting that oil, coal, and natural gas will continue to be leading sources of energy in the decades to come. But not everyone is of the same opinion.
So we need to start thinking about this transition as an opportunity to rethink the rules, to rethink the kind of world that we want to live in, and to put justice and equity at the heart.
It's really incumbent upon countries in the US and Europe, which have benefited most from the fossil fuel dependent energy system, to assist with that transition.
Fossil fuel lobbyists have big pockets and weighty access to key decision makers. They employ strategies that see doubt about the impact of oil and gas and maintain that these fuels are crucial for energy security. They've been part of disinformation campaigns surrounding climate science and have even been to courts to fight their cause. They're buying their clients' time as the clock ticks on their role in a clean economy.